mention, for those of you that have never attended a webinar of ours before, this particular webinar presentation is being recorded, so if you do have colleagues that would benefit from the topic and would not be able to join us today, by all means you'll be able to get a link sent to you and you can forward that on to anybody who's within the industry. I also wanted to mention a couple of housekeeping items. As I go through the presentation, again, if there's any questions, you will have some time in the end of the presentation to ask those questions. And I know that there's a number of you that have just joined us and you're looking to either start practice, relocate your existing clinic. There's doctors on this webinar today that are going through a renewal of their lease agreement. And I hope that over the next 45 minutes to 55 minutes, I'll be able to address most of your concerns and at least put you in a better position to be able to negotiate your veterinary office lease agreement and protect your estate and protect the investment you've made within your clinic. And for any of you that have not attended any of our lectures or have taken a CE course of ours, just some information in regards to why we're hosting this webinar and who we are. We were founded by healthcare professionals back in 1994. We analyze thousands of office lease agreements every single year, and we have represented over 1,000 practitioners back in 2015. So just last year, we negotiated over 1,000 different lease agreements for doctors somewhere in North America. And we have negotiated over 12,000 leases over the last 2 decades. We do conduct over 150 educational seminars annually in person and participate in many veterinary conferences. We are certified. In addition to that, we are today in the fortunate position to be known as the premier tenant representation firm for veterinarians in North America. And we are also a partner of Henry Schein Animal Health. I know some of you heard about us through Henry Schein Animal Health, so welcome, and we are very proud to support their customers and ensuring that they have a properly negotiated lease agreement. And some interesting statistics for those of you that have really not delved a lot into the real estate part of your business. Over 75% of animal healthcare practitioners have office leases that can prevent them from being able to ever sell their practice. And I've been with the company for now 5 years, and I've noticed that a lot of veterinarians, unfortunately, do have significant personal exposure in their lease agreement and have signed their leases in their personal names, therefore providing their landlord with a personal guarantee. And the other aspect of real estate for veterinarians, and this is a positive attribute of having a veterinarian in your building if you're a landlord, there's some really interesting contributions that veterinarians make. One of them is that they do drive a significant amount of foot traffic generally to Plaza. And in addition to that, you typically pay your rent on time. You have low default rates in comparison to some of the more traditional retail businesses. You make significant investments in leasehold improvements. For any of you that have gone through a build out of a clinic, you know exactly what I'm talking about when it comes to what cost and expense you incurred to build your clinic. And we also know that because of this investment you've made in your facility, that you are going to increase the value of that facility long term, because once you make that significant investment within the premises, at that point in time, the landlord actually owns the leasehold improvements. So what you've essentially done is you've improved the landlord's property so that in the event you decided to move out of the space, the landlord can now lease that space as a fully built out veterinary clinic to another practitioner. On the flip side, if your landlord cannot lease the space to another practitioner and you decide to move out of your building, then the landlord could force you to have to restore the space, depending on how your lease is written up, to the condition it was in prior to the build-out of the clinic. So it becomes a deterrent to ever move. And some of you have this liability in your lease agreement. But going back to the main objectives of today's presentation, first and foremost, I'd like to make sure that by the end of this presentation, you all have a clear sense of why the lease agreement is so important. We're also going to discuss how a carefully designed lease can help protect your wealth and estate through means of incorporation. We're also going to discuss the key terms within the, and I should say, veterinary office lease agreement here. I know there's a number of dentists that are also on this webinar, and I did actually just come back from Tyson's Corner in Virginia, and there's a number of doctors, dentists specifically, in the room that attended this particular presentation, and we're asking me the same questions that many veterinarians ask us throughout the lease negotiation process, which is, how do I make sure that I can protect the investment I've made in my clinic? So with that said, what is a lease agreement? When you think about lease negotiations and signing a lease agreement, the way that most veterinarians look at a lease negotiation is that when they're signing a lease agreement, it's really the rental rate that they're wanting to negotiate. And I'll be the first to tell you that the rent is very important. After staff salaries, generally speaking, most practitioners, if you look at their occupancy expense, the rent amount that they pay every month is generally the top three line items as far as expenses within the office. So rent is very important. But the other aspect of negotiating a lease agreement, which is often forgotten about, is all the legal terms within your contract. So the way I like to personally look at a lease agreement for a veterinarian is that, yes, it's like a check, right, because it defines how much you pay in rent, who you pay to, and when you make that payment. But unfortunately, this check gets stapled to very, very onerous contract, right? Whether your lease is 6 pages or 60 pages, I'm certain that a lot of you have read different sections of your lease and have probably not understood what specific terms within your veterinary lease agreement mean. And it's important to know what these terms mean because it can affect your liability, both for your estate as well as for the clinic itself. Now, the reason why the office lease is so important, first and foremost, we know it's a significant expense to build out a clinic. For the individuals that are on today's webinar that are thinking about starting up a clinic, you'll often find that the cost to build is well over $100 a square foot in most states. And so it's also very difficult and time-consuming to move once you've made that significant investment, and it's not easy to have to relocate a clinic, as any practitioner would tell you that's gone through a relocation, because there will be attrition, right? There will be attrition of your patient base, and the lease is also very important to practice sale. To give you an example, just last week I got a phone call from a veterinarian who had a lease agreement that was expiring in a year and a half, and she decided at the age of 61, she decided she'd like to retire. Her husband had also been working for many years, and she wanted to take the time in the next decade or so to be able to really enjoy traveling around the world. And so what she decided to do was list the practice for sale. And to her surprise, she found out that when buyers were inquiring about the practice, they were asking her, when does the lease expire? Because for them, they wanted some long-term predictability in the location. And unfortunately, this particular veterinarian had approached her landlord to discuss a renewal, knowing how important it was for the purchasers of the clinic. And to her shock, she found out that the landlord was planning on selling the property and had no interest in renewing her lease agreement. So now she's stuck, in essence, with a year and a half of remaining term and the need to sell the practice. And the question here is whether she'll be forced to relocate in order to be able to sell her asset. Now, there's a number of benefits that come along with a properly negotiated lease agreement. And the first benefit is fair and affordable financial terms. So what I mean by that is if you have a lease agreement, how much rent are you paying? Is the rental rate in line with the going rates in the market? And in addition to that, what type of lease do you actually have? Do you have a gross lease agreement whereby you're paying your landlord a flat amount of rent every month that goes to cover the costs of the facility, and you don't pay anything more if the landlord has to do any repairs on the building, you're not paying for taxes or insurance? Or are you in a triple net lease, which is a type of lease agreement on a property where the tenant agrees to pay all real estate taxes, building insurance, and maintenance, and these three are called the three nets within a triple net lease on the property, in addition to any normal fees that are expected under the agreement, such as rent and utilities. So if you have a lease, it's important to know what type of lease agreement you have and whether or not the rental rate is aligned with the going rates in the marketplace. The second thing that a lease agreement should provide is long-term stability and security. And what I mean by this, going back to my example of the veterinarian who had a year and a half of remaining term, you can imagine that being in her position, having a year and a half of term doesn't provide you with long-term stability, nor will it allow the incoming tenant to benefit from practicing in the same location without moving. So long-term stability to me is ideally a 10-year lease with multiple options to renew. And the options to renew are options, meaning you don't have to exercise them if you change your mind about whether or not you want to stay in the building. But it's important to sign a long-term lease unless you hate your location. But most doctors that I find that have already built up their clinic, the last thing on their mind generally is a relocation. So knowing this, why not set the lease agreement up so that you can continue practicing in the same space? And a 10-year lease agreement should provide you with a great amount of stability within the decade. In addition to that, the options to renew are there for your benefit to give you an additional 15 years of term. The third thing that your lease agreement should do for you, if it's properly negotiated, is it should provide you with minimal risk and personal exposure. So have a look at your lease if you've already signed it, or if you're in talks with the broker about signing an offer or letter of intent for a space. Have a look at the document and see whether or not you signed this document under your personal name. Too many doctors that I advise have actually signed a lease agreement not on behalf of a corporation. They've signed it in their personal name. And what that means is they have this personal obligation to pay the rent, regardless of what happens with their business. For all the landlord cares, the business could go bankrupt. But if you have personally signed a lease agreement, if you have a house, if you have other assets, those can all serve as collateral to make sure the landlord gets paid the rent. And so the landlord could actually come after your personal assets or the estate upon your death if you haven't been paying the rent. In addition to that, the lease agreement should maximize your flexibility. And a great example of that is if you decided to, for example, add additional space, would you be able to do so? If the space next to you becomes vacant, do you have the right of first refusal to be able to expand into that adjacent space and expand at a fair rental rate, meaning the landlord is not going to gouge you on a per square foot basis for having the need to expand, you're going to be able to secure that additional space through a clause in your lease agreement that's going to be essentially utilized to obtain a fair and affordable deal. You really should also, for those of you that are thinking about transitioning in the next 5 years, your release should really help you sell the practice, because the lease agreement does factor in to the valuation of your veterinary office. Aside from the equipment and the patient charts, the lease does play a fundamental role in determining practice value. Now, this is where I now get into what is in your lease agreement. I do want to mention that what we try and do on this 1-hour webinar is introduce you to some of the key terms within your office lease agreement, so that hopefully by the end of today's presentation, you're much more informed about some of the common traps and provisions within the veterinary office lease agreement. The first one I'd like to discuss with you is called an option to renew. And an option to renew is a provision within your contract, within your lease agreement, which allows you, the tenant, to be able to extend the term of your lease agreement for a defined period of time. Generally, the option to renew is about 5 years in duration. Now, options are found in the majority of the leases. About 90% of the leases that we review have an option to renew in it. And the way the option is written, it is written generally for the benefit of the landlord. It usually says that if you exercise the option, you must do so by a certain period of time, say 6 to 9 months prior to the expiry of your contract. And for those of you that have an option and you feel that you need to renegotiate your rent, I generally don't recommend exercising the option as a way of getting a better lease. And I'll tell you why. Because most options are written in such a way, if you read the fine print, it says by exercising, in many cases, the option to renew, in no event will your rental rate ever go down. And you can imagine why that's a problem. If you are overpaying in rent and you exercise your option, you're going to be stuck paying high rental rate. You don't have the benefit of renegotiating the rent in many cases. And then other options are ambiguous in the sense that they don't even mention what the rental rate is to be. And what happens with most doctors is they wait until the deadline for exercising the option, which is generally less than 12 months prior to the expiry of the lease. And by that point, the landlord knows that you have very little leverage to negotiate the deal. If they offer a certain rental rate, chances are you're going to be forced to accept it because you don't have the luxury of moving with less than a year of remaining term. Now, the example before you, the first problem with it is that its option to renew here is personal to the tenant, meaning if you were the doctor who was in this space and you decide to sell the practice, the buyer would not be able to exercise the option. The second problem with this option to renew language is that it states that as long as the tenant hasn't been in default, can the tenant actually exercise the option. So if you haven't paid your rent or you haven't abided by the operating hours of the shopping center that you're in, then the landlord can take away the option to renew. And it says further on that if you decide to exercise the option, the landlord has the right to ask you to sign their then standard form lease. And just today, we were contacted by a doctor who went to exercise her option to renew. She built the clinic, and she signed an initial term of 5 years. And when she went to the landlord to exercise her option, and she told us what had happened was the landlord had said to her, since we bought the building 2 years ago, so she built the clinic 4.5 years ago, the building was sold during the first 5-year term. And what occurred was this new landlord that bought the property has said to her, if you want to renew the lease, that's fine, thanks for your notice, but you're going to have to sign our standard form lease. because our standard form lease agreement is different than the previous landlord's. So realize that having an option to renew, which forces you to sign the landlord's then current standard form lease, is not advantageous, because that lease agreement could contain provisions you've never seen before. In addition to that, it states within this option to renew example that the rental rate will never go down, and the way the landlord is going to determine the rental rate will be predicated on the market rent for renewing tenants in the building. So if you happen to have a very well-known franchise in your building or a very successful retailer, well, if they go to renew their lease and they pay $2 more a square foot per year, that's going to drive up your rental rates, because the landlord, as per this option to renew, is going to look at what other rental rates they've offered existing tenants in the building. And that's certainly no fair way of determining fair market rent for an option to renew. The second provision I'd like to discuss with you all is called assignment. And assignment is a provision within your lease agreement that dictates how, when, and what requirements need to be met in order for you to be able to transfer your existing lease agreement to another veterinarian or another corporation. And the reason why assignment is important is most practice sales occur with the selling doctor transferring their lease agreement to the buyer, not the selling doctor having the buyer enter into a new lease with the landlord. Because most often, if the landlord wants to enter into a new lease agreement, the only reason why they're going to do that is, number one, to drive up rental rates, and number two, to change the legal terms. If you can imagine, why would the landlord want to go through the hassle of signing a new lease with your purchaser if there's already a lease in place? They use that as an opportunity to renegotiate the terms so that they're more favorable for the landlord. And assignment provisions are found in approximately 3 out of 4 leases that we review. The problem with this particular assignment language is, number one, it says that if you want to sign your lease, you have to obtain the landlord's consent, which is fine, right? It's okay that you have to get the landlord's permission, but your landlord should not have the right upon notification to terminate your lease just because you're looking to transfer it. And the reason why the landlord has the right to terminate the lease agreement is, if you think about it, the landlord wants to have leverage when you decide to sell your business. And what better way to have leverage than to terminate the seller's existing lease, if the doctor's looking to sell her clinic, and go to the buyer and try and negotiate a completely new deal with the buyer. Maybe ask for a bit more rent, maybe ask for an unlimited personal guarantee, and also have the selling doctor on the hook financially if the new tenant defaults. In addition to that, the landlord, as I mentioned, has the right in many cases to go after the selling doctor if the buyer defaults. So imagine you're trying to sell your clinic and you transfer your lease agreement to the purchaser, and the purchaser doesn't pay the landlord rent 2 years later and stops paying rent for 4 months. Based on this language in the assignment section of your lease, the landlord can legally collect the rent from the previous tenant, because what it says is that the tenant shall not be released from its obligations under the lease and shall remain liable for any failure of the tenant or its assignees or subtenants, assignee meaning the doctor who takes over your space. So having continuous liability in a lease agreement is no way to protect your estate, and I highly recommend having that provision renegotiated. There are other traps within a veterinary office lease agreement. For the sake of time, I'm not going to go through all of them, but if any of you have questions regarding any of these other provisions within your veterinary lease agreement, you're more than welcome to contact us, and we will have a read through the lease you have signed and provide you with some advice on how to renegotiate some of these other very important terms. And to summarize some of the critical lease terms, because most of you have attended and joined us today to be able to get some education. So the first thing that you should realize is you need to have term on your lease agreement. I don't care whether you're looking to build a practice from scratch, or you're about to renew the lease agreement, or you're going to sell your practice. Unless, again, you don't like your building and you think it's not doing you any favors by being there, it's important to have plenty of terms. So ideally, again, a 10-year term with multiple options to renew. You ideally don't want to have any personal guarantees in place. If you do have a personal guarantee in place, you want to be able to limit that guarantee to a certain duration of time, and ideally even a certain dollar amount, so that you're not personally exposed on the contract. You want to have a good assignment provision, which gives you the ability to be able to transfer your lease to another practitioner. And I know some of you had asked me via email, knowing you're going to be on this webinar, whether or not, if your lease says the landlord has to be reasonable in its concerns in terms of assigning the lease, is that sufficient language? And I'll tell you that reasonability of a lease agreement and an assignment of the lease agreement is looked at within the context of real estate, not within the context of selling a veterinary clinic. So I'll give you another analogy. If you decided to sell your practice and you found a young associate or an individual who graduated 4 or 5 years ago, and that person had $55,000 in debt, and your net worth happens to be $600,000, and you go to assign or transfer your lease agreement, it is completely reasonable for the landlord to deny a transfer of the lease, because you're transferring the lease agreement to an individual who has a lower net worth than you do. So net worth is often used as a measure to determine whether or not the landlord is going to be able to transfer the lease or even agree to it on the same terms and conditions. The last critical term I'd like to bring up is definitibility. And so what I mean by that is, for those of you that have a lease and you're the only veterinarian in your clinic, it's important to have the right to be able to terminate the lease agreement if something happens to you. God forbid, if you become disabled and cannot practice, or alternatively, if you pass away. I got a phone call last year from a grieving spouse of a veterinarian, and he had explained to me that his biggest concern with this practice was that both him and his wife, his late wife, had signed a lease in their personal names. He's not a veterinarian. She was. And unfortunately, knowing that he had signed this lease agreement or co-signed it at the time that built out the clinic, he was concerned that because of the fact that the lease was going to expire in 6 years, the landlord would continue to ask for the rent checks, despite his late wife not obviously being able to look after the business. And so his challenge was finding another veterinarian to buy the clinic, and he happened to be in a very rural area, and he had a hard time selling this clinic. So he called us to find out if there's a way to actually terminate the lease agreement prior to its 6-year expiry. And unfortunately, too many lease agreements do not have an early termination right for the benefit of the tenant. And it is something that we recommend adding to your lease agreement to strengthen your flexibility. Now, some of you are asking me, what is the right time, Sina? I've been in my building for a number of years. My lease is coming up for renewal and for 5 years. When is the actual right time to negotiate the lease? And my answer to you is that the right time to negotiate a lease agreement is not when your deadline for renewal is in the lease. If your lease says that the option to renew must be exercised 12 months prior to the expiration, I don't actually recommend that you wait that long. The ideal time to negotiate a lease agreement is 24 months to 30 months in advance. And I'll tell you why. When you go to your landlord with a lease that expires in, say, 12 months, and you try and negotiate the rental rate, the landlord's not going to give in as easily, right, to your request to lower the rent or keep it the same, because the landlord knows that most veterinarians are going to have a hard time moving their practice with less than a year of term left. If you think about the process for going through site selection, ensuring that you have the right permit, the space is zoned for a veterinary clinic, for medical use, you have the ability to actually move your equipment to that location. And if you're, say, doing boarding, you can actually do that within the facility. These are all things that are going to affect your timeline for being able to relocate. And construction, oftentimes is getting delayed. So when you put a plan in place, you need to have a buffer in case things take longer than expected. And all the different components that go into determining which site is better and what site is going to suit your needs require a lot of due diligence, which in turn requires a lot of time. So hence why landlords are going to be tougher to deal with if you have a lease agreement that is expiring in less than 24 months. And every month that goes by, and the closer you get to the expiry of your lease agreement, the more leverage your landlord has to obtain a better deal for themselves. Now, in terms of how we go about negotiating lease agreements, we're pretty transparent. I know that there's a number of lawyers and colleagues of us in the industry that, generally don't really go through a whole bunch of information as it relates to how they negotiate leases. And for us, there's a 7-step process that we follow, and we'd love to discuss this with our students, because we find that the more knowledge you have in regards to the preparation process for negotiating a lease agreement, the better off the industry is as a whole. There's no shortage of doctors today that are in lease agreements, and the more we can educate our colleagues in terms of how to better negotiate a lease agreement, the more beneficial it is for the industry overall, because we're not going to be in situations where we're held hostage by our landlord. So the first step in our process that we follow is we ensure that we obtain a copy of the signed lease agreement. Too many doctors we work with, unfortunately, don't have an executed copy of their lease on file. They may have signed it, but their landlord's signature isn't on it. After obtaining a copy of the lease, we then review the lease agreement. We go through the critical terms and provisions, and we highlight all the risks. After we've gone through the due diligence of reading the lease, we do a bit of market research. So this is where we go in and we look at the vacancy rate in your building. We look at the rental rates in the area. We look at comparable buildings and determine, as a veterinarian, are you overspending in rent? If your production is $600,000 and 25% of your production is going towards rent, that's simply unsustainable long term. So we do look at these ratios to determine whether or not the rental rate is going to be affordable, both now as well as over the next 5 to 10 to 15 years. After we've gone through the steps of reviewing the lease agreement, conducting market research on rental rates and vacancy rates, we like to discuss with our clients what's the ideal outcome for them. It goes without saying that if you have your lawyer negotiate a lease agreement, if they don't spend a proper amount of time trying to define your goals and objectives, they may be able to make some edits and changes to your lease, but those changes are not going to be worth much to you, or they may not be worth that much to the purchaser of the clinic. So it's very important for us, before we call the landlord, to go through the process of finding out what's most critical to our clients. And if you're about to negotiate a lease agreement yourself, with the help of your lawyer, it's important to sit down with your advisor and really go through the process of what's going to happen with the practice within the next 5, 10, 15 years. Where are you at right now? Do a good analysis of what issues you've had. I mean, there's a doctor that I spoke with. I delivered a lecture last week, and he came up to me and said to me, Sina, there's 3 things that are bothering me. One is the fact that my heating and ventilation system, the HVAC unit within my building needs to be replaced, and the estimated cost is about $11,000. Number 2, there is a cigar shop that's within my plaza, and there's a bunch of people outside that loiter, and not the greatest look for my business to be located 3 doors down from this cigar shop. And so is there anything we can do there? And then the third thing he was concerned with was the fact that his landlord had approached him about a month ago and asked him whether or not he'd be open to moving to a different unit. And when it came time to discuss the cost of relocation, the landlord was not providing any details as to whether or not they would be willing to pay for the build-out of his new clinic within the new premises. And it turns out that there was another tenant who was looking to move into the building, and because this veterinarian had the end cap unit, it was a desirable location, and so this landlord was trying to accommodate the needs of the prospective tenant by trying to convince our veterinary friend to move his clinic to a different end of the shopping center. So these things are relevant to the person. It depends on who's the tenant and what career stage they're at, and we try and find out what's most important to the practitioner, because you're the one who's going to be in the space physically. And if the issues you've had are not being addressed, it doesn't really matter, right, that the rental rate was negotiated and you saved 35 cents a square foot, because some of these problems, frankly, are a lot bigger than an additional 25 cents or $1 or $3 a square foot. So knowing that, it's important that we properly go through due diligence and lay out some goals. And to summarize today's webinar, the key details of your dental office lease agreement can cost you hundreds of thousands of dollars if left alone. Rent is very important. We definitely spend a lot of time negotiating the rent with landlords, but it's not just about rent. It's really about maximizing your flexibility as a practice owner, minimizing any risks within your lease agreement, and hopefully achieving some long-term peace of mind. And for those of you that believe that you don't have any leverage whatsoever, I should remind you that having negotiated over 10,000 lease agreements, we've had doctors in every situation come to us, whether they're month to month, their lease is already expired, or they have 6 months or 8 months of remaining term. And it really comes down to how effective of a job you do in negotiating the key terms within your lease. So you want to be strategic, but you don't get what you deserve. You certainly get what you negotiate into your lease agreement. And you want to start the negotiation process early, so ideally 24 months at least in advance, and you want to have a plan in place. So now what I'd like to do, since we have approximately 10 minutes or so, what I'd like to do now is I'd like to take some questions from you all, and if you can do me a favor, and if you do have questions, please type them in the chat window that is located on the top half of your monitor. And you'll see some comments I made earlier which discuss the fact that we're going to begin the webinar shortly. I wrote that comment 45 minutes ago. So if you have questions, by all means, type them in, and I will address them as they come. And then on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, there are some online resources that you can download anything from a veterinary office lease review and rent analysis information sheet, in addition to information on the assignment process and lease acquisition process. And then on the right-hand side of your screen, you can click and download some of our white papers, including relocation and renewal guides. And for those of you that are thinking about buying or expanding, we have guides for that as well. I have a question here from, and I won't mention the name. I know not all of you have actually agreed to necessarily disclose your names. So I have a question here saying, what is your consultation fee? And the answer, and I have an answer for you. You'll actually really appreciate this. Thanks to the generous sponsorship of Henry Schein Animal Health, we can afford to offer the first 5 individuals that reach out to us having attended this webinar with a complimentary veterinary office lease review. So what I'm going to do in a moment is I'm going to put up a slide with my contact information, and if you or any of the other doctors, the first 5 attendees that reach out to me will be eligible for a consultation. Thereafter, the fee is a fee of $1,495. So for anybody that is not one of the first 5 attendees, you will have the ability to obtain a veterinary office lease review and consultation for that fee. Here's my contact information. I'll put it back up again. I want to get back to the questions, but I'll put it back up again in a couple of minutes. So again, for those of you that are interested in a lease review, if you contact me and you're one of the first 5 attendees to do so, you'll be able to get a review done for no cost. Let me go back to the question page here. I have another question here. Is it normal for a landlord to incorporate an annual increase, say 2% to the base rental rate for the duration of the lease term? The question of normalcy depends on where you're located, doctor. So I generally see a 2% increase in markets where the rental rates are going up, right? So if you're in a market today or you're in a location where rental rates in the area have actually gone down year over year, then a 2% increase is too much. But a 2%, and then I'll tell you why landlords love the 2% figure. It all goes to the fact that 2% is generally the inflation rate in the country, right? So if a landlord is able to increase your rent along with inflation, then the way they look at it is inflation adjusted, they're making a good return on their investment. Now, the 2% increase can actually be controlled. What I try and do, and it all depends on whether you're trying to build a practice for the first time or if you're an existing practice owner. But one of the things I try and do when a doctor's got a lease agreement is if I know they're going to build a practice from scratch, I will try to keep the rental rate flat for the first couple of years, knowing that their expenses are higher in the beginning 2 or 3 years of the lease than the latter 7 years. So from that perspective, there's ways in which we can restructure the term of the lease and the rental rate to offset costs in correlation with production. But the 2% increase, I'd be interested, doctor, if you want to send us your lease, for us to have a look at what you're paying and what the starting point is. Because if you start paying below market rent, then the 2% increase doesn't sound so bad. But we have to make sure that that 2% increase isn't continuous and also doesn't apply necessarily to your option to renew. I have another question. I'll take this question because some of you may be building a clinic. Thinking about building a new clinic across the street, this doctor's mentioned from our current location, we have 3 years left in our lease. What are the possibilities of terminating the lease early? I love that question. In a nutshell, the way in which we try and address this problem, if you have an opportunity to relocate sooner than your current term ends, you have to approach the landlord and do one of two things. Either negotiate an early termination, meaning if you have 3 years of term left, what is the maximum amount of time your landlord wants you to pay rent? Maybe they believe they're not going to be able to lease the space for at least another 2 years. So you may end up paying a 2-year penalty for terminating early. The other way to approach it is to go out and find a tenant yourself to take over your space. Now, I do understand that if you're a veterinarian versus, say, a dentist, and you try to move across the street, chances are anybody who you move into your space will also be a veterinarian. And because they're a veterinarian, they're going to be competing with you, right? Whereas, say, a general dentist could move an orthodontist or a specialist across the street who's not in competition with them. So in the past, we've been successful in terminating leases early. It all comes down to how much time the landlord generally needs to fill your space, or what do they believe is a fair termination fee, maybe 6 months worth of rent, maybe a year worth of rent, in some cases longer. And the answer also differs depending on how occupied the property is. What I mean by that is if there's 35% vacancy in the property, it's a lot easier to do an early termination, or sometimes it's not because the landlord is struggling, right? They want your rent checks because you're one of the remaining tenants in the building. So I would be happy to have a look at the way your current lease is structured. And one strategy as well is to determine whether or not you could sublease your existing space, but it depends on what improvements you move out of the current space in order to accommodate a subtenant. The last question I'll take, if a lease is in my personal name, can it be transferred to corporation later? Great question. The answer is depends. It depends on whether or not you have a clause written in your lease agreement which allows you to transfer the lease automatically once you're incorporated. I would say 99%, I rarely see this, of doctors that have a lease that have signed it personally cannot transfer to a corporation without having signed a personal guarantee or indemnity agreement. What I mean by that is if at the time you built the clinic you weren't incorporated and you already signed a lease, if you go to your landlord now and try to sign your lease agreement to your corporation, the landlord still wants you on the hook. So what we try and do is we try and facilitate the negotiation of transferring the lease agreement to the corporation along the same time that we renew the lease. So if your lease comes up for renewal in the next 2 to 3 years, we'll approach the landlord, and this is one of the changes that we ask for now that you're incorporated. It's one of the concessions that we negotiate with the landlord. And the reason why we're more successful at it during a renewal is the landlord has been given something in return. What they're given is more term, right? If your lease expires in 24 months and I approach your landlord and offer a 10-year renewal, the landlord's motivated. He's interested. But if I make it a condition of the renewal that we're going to take your name, we're going to cross it off the lease, and we're going to put your corporation down as a tenant, the landlord is more likely to agree to that during a renewal than, say, if your lease expires in 7 years. Great. So I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar. And if you have any additional questions, again, I'm going to put up my contact information. And if you are one of the first 5 attendees who reach out to us, you'll be entitled to a complimentary veterinary office lease review. I do wish every one of you all the best in your negotiation if you're planning on negotiating a lease agreement. and we look forward to being of any assistance to you all if you do have questions regarding your lease or rental rates, or you're about to undertake the exciting journey of building a practice for the first time. And we will ensure that you obtain a recorded copy of this presentation within the next 3 to 5 business days, and we'll also ensure that you have the ability, if you have any questions, again, to send those to us, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So again, thank you very much for your time, and I hope that you enjoy the rest of your week.